I was working at a election in Eagle, and they were talking about this speaker they'd heard on the Niles Cemetery, so I got his information, and here he is. So he's all ready.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Margaret.
Yeah.
Don't clap until I finish. I might bore you. So if there's a lesson I've learned in my time, it's I don't know what I don't know. And the best way I can punctuate that is 4 students one day, college students, decided they were going to cut class. They had a test they didn't want to take. So they called the professor, and they knew the professor was a good person, and they said, well, look, you know, one of them called and said, hey, we got a flat tire. 4 of us together, we got a flat tire. We're not going to make the test. Is it all right if we take it tomorrow? And the professor said, sure, as long as I get the opportunity to change the test, and the students thought that was fair. They had a great day, went and did whatever they did. Come to class the next day, and the professor separated them into 4 separate rooms. And the exam only had 2 questions. Your name and what tire was flat. I have learned over the years to say, I don't know what I don't know. Because when it comes to your history, I'm a son of Clinton County. I grew up on a farm and still live on the same farm that has been in my family for almost 180 years. Our family farm was founded in 1852. I dug up the original deed a couple of years ago. That was really neat to see. And I still farm there with my dad, my uncle, a brother, and a cousin. And we raise beef cattle, corn, wheat, and soybeans. I worked in agriculture my whole career. Both my degrees are from MSU in engineering. And I worked for Farm Bureau for 24 years, served there, farmers of the state, all over the state. And I now work for the Michigan corn growers. So I work for people who grow corn around the state. But I have an affinity for history. I've always enjoyed it. I had a great uncle, my great-grandfather's brother, that I spent a lot of time with, my Uncle Marion. And Uncle Marion was a teacher in Fowler. He was the superintendent of schools. He was a bachelor his whole life. And he took me to cemeteries all the time. And Uncle Marion was never married, had money, but you wouldn't know it. One of those folks that lived through the Depression, hid everything they had, and he was cheap. There was no other way to put it. It wasn't fiscally responsible, it was cheap. We would pick out flowers, strike me down if you heard me say it probably, but he would pick out flowers out of the garbage at cemeteries, we'd take them back to his house and spray paint them, and then put them on on relatives' graves. We're at a cemetery in Hubbardston one day, and that day I wish I could play over in my head. I have a good memory, but that day he took me to a grave, and he said, this person's our relation, but no one knows. You're the only one that's going to know after I die. And I can't find that to save my life. But that day, a teenager, I like history, but you can only absorb so much when you're a teenager walking cemeteries with your uncle. Well, there was a bench, a really nice one, and forgive me if it was your family. It was a really nice, like, wrought iron bench with the wrought iron ivy and stuff. And he said, pick that up. I said, why? They don't want it. It was at the end of the row. And I think his opinion, anything at the end of the row was fair game. And I said, oh, it's in front of their stuff. And he said, no, they don't want it. I said, Unc, there's concrete piers poured for the legs. They intended it to be here. I listened to my uncle, I put it in the back of the truck, and now it sits in front of my ancestors in a small cemetery across the road from my house. So I've enjoyed history over the years. I enjoy stories. I spent quite a bit of time in Clinton County working with the Clinton County Farm Bureau. We created a couple of years ago a scavenger hunt of Clinton County. All the cool stories that I could find in 2 major books. Judge Dabble wrote a book in 1903 that was a complete history of Clinton County. And then there was another volume that was created in 1981. It was a compendium of everything that he had, plus everything that happened up to 1981 in the county. My uncle was a co-author. And there's just so much in those old books. They were old copies that were his, now they're mine. And it was fun to build. a scavenger hunt because we all too often forget things that happened around us. In Clinton County, people don't remember, you probably do, and again, you know more about history than I do, especially this neck of the woods, but people forget about the Bath bombing disaster. The fact that many kids were killed as a result of someone bombing the school in Bath. I didn't hear about that until I was in high school. I was floored when I heard about it. One of my favorite stories I learned about was the Clinton County Salt Works. In 1836, the state forms, and one of the first actions of the legislature is to pass the Clinton County Salt Works law. The original township that I grew up in was called Lebanon Township, but that wasn't its original name. Much like many of the townships that you have here in Ionia County, their original names were washed away by the state legislature in 1844. Many of them had Native American names. The original name of Lebanon Township was Wendagon. Wendagon was Ojibwe for salt, and salt was discovered in Clinton County, about 3 miles away from as the crow flies, away from where I grew up. So the legislature passed the law to create the Clinton County Salt Works, and money started pouring in to develop this salt mine because salt was worth a lot. There was it's like a wildcat banking kind of a thing where people just were investing, and a factory got built, and then the history book tells a story that it didn't want to tell, that there was never any salt there. Some guy named Parks lied. He'd sunk a couple 50-gallon barrels of salt, made everybody believe that a salt mine was there, and took all their money and ran. And the guy that wrote the history book really did not want to write that. Judge Dabble did not want to put that in history, but it was part of it. Everything from Mexican counterfeiting rings in Olive Township to towns that no longer exist. Every county has their ghost towns, little encampments that may have had everything from factories to, there's a little, if you're familiar, on the other side of Westphalia is a small Lutheran church, St. Paul's Lutheran Church. And right next to it was a town called Forest Hill. I actually found pictures of their little minor league baseball team, and the town no longer exists. It had everything from a cheese factory to a bowl factory, and it's gone. And you can just see one building where it was. But just like many of the towns, just like Portland, if you didn't get a major road coming close to you, or you didn't get a railroad, it wasn't enough to be on a river. I live close to Maple Rapids. Maple Rapids was once considered to, in accordance with something that was written, to maybe looked at for the state capital of Michigan. And when they couldn't get a railroad, they couldn't have a town. And it's amazing how towns formed around infrastructure. And that really was the story of Eagle. Before I get to that, the only reason I'm here tonight, I gave a presentation. I told you I love agriculture. I've worked in agriculture for 27 years. I've been all over the state. I've been on thousands of farms. And I did a presentation of what Clinton County agriculture was like from its beginnings. The research was fun. You can find a lot of information. I didn't realize originally the Secretary of State was responsible for holding all the agricultural information of the state, what was grown where. And I was able to find those books in the archives at Michigan State University. I found one that was old enough that they wouldn't let me touch it without gloves, and actually they set it on 2 foam pads so that I could look at it because it was the only surviving copy of it. But I could show the people that came to see that night what was grown over the last, since about 1850 in Clinton County. How it changed, and it's the same in Ionia. It started as wheat. Everybody planted wheat because that's what we learned to plant in Europe. Everybody in Clinton County, majority, before Westphalia was populated with Germans, the majority of people came from England, Ireland, Germany. They all stayed in New York for a little while, and they brought those New York names across. That's why DeWitt is DeWitt. DeWitt Clinton was the governor of the state of New York. He was a U.S. senator. He founded the Erie Canal. But that's why Clinton County is Clinton County, and that's why DeWitt is DeWitt. We had a lot of things named after places in New York in our county, and I'm sure that many of the names that you have here in Ionia County would probably follow the same and came from either out east in the eastern part of the United States or all the way from England or wherever you translocated from. I have relations from Portland, a lot of great German blood, but it's a pretty good mix and pot too. So I gave the presentation on Clinton County agriculture, and a couple people liked it, and they heard me speak, and they said, hey, will you come out on a fall day and speak at the Niles Cemetery about eagle? And I'm like, well, okay, sure. So I agreed to doing it, and the day came, and I said, well, you know, I've got pictures. Well, we don't have PowerPoint. We're going to be outside the cemetery. Okay, well, this is going to be different then. And my presentation is on 2 pieces of paper. So forgive me if I read a little bit to you, but the information was good, and I'll try not to bore you as I read. So Eagle Township, from the beginnings, from what I saw, and it folded in a lot of information that I saw when I did my Clinton County work. Founded in 1831. The first people to come and settle Eagle were Anthony Niles, the founder of the Niles Cemetery, who was named after the Niles Cemetery, and the Stephen Goger families that made their way from Detroit, from New York, on the steamboat, the Robert Fulton. Actually, that's one of the things you studied as a grade schooler, the Robert Fulton steamboat. Well, they came on that steamboat. They made their way to DeWitt. DeWitt was the first really encampment inside of Clinton County. And that was the home of David Scott. He was a major in the military, and they stayed at his place. In DeWitt, they joined up with a man named Daniel Clark, Herman Thomas, and John Benson. The Clark family, so if you go on Clark Road, on the very south end of Clinton County, Pete Clark and his family still, Pete no longer farms out there obviously, but his son keeps farming out there. But the Clark family's been around as long as the area has. They decided to build rafts when they were in DeWitt, and they're gonna get in rafts, and they're gonna have the Looking Glass. The original name of the Looking Glass River was the Wabwassin. The rafts, it says in the text, stuck a snag, and they were abandoned. What that means to me is, I built my share of rafts in the creek when I was a kid, and they sink, especially when you load them up full of stuff. So they eventually moved their goods they made dugout canals, they knocked trees down, they dug out the trees, and eventually they sank. So they got swamped under the weight. So all the goods were offloaded in section 23, right around where Eagle is, in what is now Eagle Township. Some of the folks decided to load up the empty boats, and they headed to where now is Portland. So some of those folks, the Bensons and the Thomases, were some of the original settlers of Portland area. So as they were coming along, if you're familiar with the Erie Canal, which I was not until I did some reading, I didn't understand that when they made that canal across New York State so they could get to the Great Lakes, it was it truly was a canal, and they hooked horses on either side of it, and they pulled people. I think they tried to do the same thing with this group of people, to pull them along and pull all their stuff to where they would get, including livestock. So Mr. Niles decided to pitch his tent with all the goods, because they had to watch over their stuff when they offloaded it in Eagle. Other folks went on, but he stayed. One of his cows strayed from the camp, and Niles spent the next day looking for the cow. Eventually he settled there, returned the entire party, and he found his cow. So Daniel Clark and Herman Thomas started for White Pigeon Land Office, and they secured that land, which eventually became Eagle. So some of the first things that I saw in the literature of things that happened in Eagle, Ezekiel Niles felled the first tree. The first birth was Susan Groger. The first church organization was erected by Anthony Niles. The first sawmill was built by Philo Beers. I don't know if you know any Beers from the Portland and Westphalia area. I know a couple of them. And then Daniel, David, Henry, and Jonas, also Beers, also the first areas of that area for wheat. 1841, jumping ahead a couple of years, Eagle Township grew. Eagle Township at that point split from an original township. If you follow history, you know there were only a few townships in each county, and they just kept splitting. So Watertown Township was the larger one, touches all the way up on the north side of Lansing. It split, and then you had Eagle Township. There were 45 resident taxpayers in 1841 in Eagle Township, and there were some relatively large landowners. Stephen Groger had 120 acres. Some had as high as W.F. Jensen had 240 acres. Joseph Eddy had 385 acres in multiple sections. When I think about that, and I think about what it took to clear old growth forest to actually be farmed, that's a lot of ground. You think about an acre as being a football field. 385 football fields, you're going to clear off every tree on it to be able to do agriculture, because that's what they did. At that time, 98% of the people who live in the countryside farmed. That's what they did. Eventually, we moved to cities, but for that period of time, it is so hard for me to fathom, in the 100 acres north of my ancestor's house, how they cleared that. With horses, dynamite, how they did that, and what it would take even by today's standards to do the same thing. In 1860, Eagle's minister was William Essler, and he was invited to the First Congregational Church in St. John's. I made it here in 29 minutes from my home north of Fowler. Imagine what they would look at us and say, you made it from where to where in 29 minutes? Did you fly on a bird? What did you do? It would be a big thing to get invited to a town that was a ways away. 1873, Eagle Village is platted with a location basically of the railroad. If it wasn't for the Detroit, Lansing, and Northern Railroad, and specifically the Ionia and Lansing Railroad, you wouldn't have Eagle. George McCrum was a leading person in Eagle. He was the one that really pushed for the railroad, because if you didn't get a railroad, you weren't a town. So Eagle originally raised $9,500. This is 1873. They raised $9,500 to basically pay off the railroad to say come and locate here. Eventually, the Supreme Court actually stepped in and said, that's illegal, you can't do that. And they charged the Village of Eagle $20,000 for doing something that was against the law. But it didn't stop Mr. McCrum, as he built a depot on his own land. A depot, the building was there before the railroad was, just to be able to coax them to be able to put it there. 1873, businesses in Eagle Village. There was the first store was built by Loyal W. Hill. The blacksmith shop was built, hardware store, church. 1873, they find coal in Eagle. There were borings that were made in Eagle Township for coal, finding a 35-inch vein at 57-foot depth. Imagine digging a hole by hand 57 feet deep to be able to find a vein of coal 35 inches in diameter. As of 1890, so that was 1873. As of 1890, they made it 35 feet down, only halfway there. So I don't know how much coal they ever excavated, but they found some. In 1878, agriculture was strong inside of Eagle Township. 62% of Eagle's land was what was considered improved, meaning there could be agriculture. They could sow crops on it, and over 189 farms. And if you had to guess, I already told you wheat was a primary crop. But when you think about what would be the main livestock that you would think of if you were thinking about if you were just coming here to sell? Sheep. We had lots of sheep. In Clinton County at one point we had 90,000 sheep. 90,000 sheep. And I grew up around sheep. Uncle Marion had sheep. And we had 300 ewes, and we had lambs every spring. I loved the lambs, but everything else about them wasn't my favorite thing in the world. It didn't make, Uncle died, and all the sheep went away. I didn't cry over that one. But sheep were just so important because they ate anything. And they were very, you could graze them on anything. We had lots of sheep in both Clinton and Ionia counties. There were a lot more people coming in 1879. There was a hotel erected, a sawmill, a planing mill, molding factory, feed mill. Something that I thought was just a fun little fact, 1880, Samuel Brown of North Eagle was recently severely kicked by a colt and is being rendered as good as new by the medicine man. It was so fun to read old newspapers from this time frame because they were colorful. They were fun news. You know, some lady got a new couch. We wonder what she did with the old one. It was just amazing what they thought was news, and it was fun to be able to read through them. In 1887, I didn't understand that this came this fast, but 1887, Eagle Village had phone lines and sidewalks. So things came fast. 1895, there are two primary cemeteries in Eagle Township. One is the big northern cemetery. It was called the Eagle Cemetery. It refers to the North Eagle Cemetery in Section 9. So as you're on your way to Westphalia, you hit those curves on Grange Road. Its notoriety came from, the name change occurred because the land was originally owned by a David Simmons, and the cemetery became known for its connection to Revolutionary War soldier Joshua Simmons II, who is buried there on his son David's land. It is a really cool, if you get a chance, if you're over in that side of neck of the woods, it's a really neat cemetery, and it's a really neat plaque that is devoted. It's not easy to find Revolutionary War soldiers inside of our area. I did think this was a neat fact too, that all that land was cleared in 1841 by a man named Levi Wilkerson. That whole cemetery was cleared by Levi Wilkerson, who was eventually named the sexton of the cemetery, and he dug over 600 graves. To dig 600 graves and be the sexton of the cemetery, is that your hobby? Is that what you do? Fairly what he did. In 1900, in the census, 1,158 people lived in Eagle Township. 1903, there were 300 people living in Eagle Township. It had a United Methodist Church. It had a Universal Church. In 1904, the Eagle elevator burned, $4,000 loss. In 1910, Prohibition settled into both Ionia and Clinton counties. And each township got to vote on how the county would go with respect to Prohibition. Eagle Township was against it. So was Westphalia. Shock. So was Fowler. Shock. But eventually, Prohibition did come to Clinton County. And eventually, it was lifted. Eagle voted for it by 167 votes. But my friend John owns the Eagle Inn. And I've got this newspaper clipping for him of when Prohibition ended in 1933. They declared it New Beer's Eve. It was midnight on May 11 of 1933. In 1911, Eagle Township had over 1,000 people. They had 339 children living there in 1926. They had a centennial celebration in 1941. They survived wars just like any community, and many of their sons and daughters are in those graves in that Niles Cemetery. In Werner Pohl in 1942 is buried there. Clyde Blum in 1944 died in France. And Leo Gilmore is also buried in the Niles Cemetery, and he received the Purple Heart. Eagle Township was big into politics. 1944, a man named John Espy was the longest serving representative in the Michigan House. Others who served in the State House were David Clark in 1851, Philo Doty in 1869, Henry Jennison served in the State Senate in 1883. The last fact that I dug into, if you're familiar with the Eagle Fair, the Eagle Days, it at one time, from what I understand, in the 1930s, was the largest livestock show in all of central Michigan. It was called the greatest little fair in the state. The annual event with the livestock show had 3,500 people attend in 1934. Reached its peak in 1948, and all of it changed in 1956 because of what? The construction of I-96. The Eagle Park and Recreation Board held their first fair in 1972, and they kept it going with Eagle Days, but there was no livestock show. I found it fascinating to read through and focus on that space, but so much of it had tentacles in other areas. One of my favorite stories I read when researching Clinton County was about Chief Okemos. Chief Okemos, if you knew, was he fought for the South in the Civil War. No, he fought for, the British. He fought for the British. And he was he actually was wounded in battle at one point. And he died. There were two major encampments of Native Americans in Clinton County. One was just, if you're familiar at all with Clinton County, if you want to go into East Lansing the back way, there's Chandler Road. right off of Chandler Road and Round Lake Road, that area, that's where he died. But his body was buried here in the Portland Cemetery. So I had not been to his headstone here in the Portland Cemetery. But as I mentioned to you, my great-great-uncle, Marion, was a big history buff. And our history teacher in, I don't know, high school, it was like freshman, sophomore year, said, you got to do a report, but you can't use a book. You can't use, we didn't have the internet at the time, so you can't use any reference except for speaking to somebody in the community. You had to write a report based on oral history. Well, there was no one else to go to besides my uncle, who was so smart. He taught me calculus from tables, not a calculator, in his 80s while I was in college. Anyway, so I stopped by one day, but he was eccentric. Yeah, he had his things going. But I stopped by and I said, hey, I got to do a paper, and I want to do it on Native Americans in the area. And he said, well, I'll come back in 2 days. And he like shut the door on me. I'm like, all right, I'll come back. I still kept, and I looked for it before I came here tonight, handwritten paper that he wrote for me about Native Americans in the area around the farm. And the last page was about Portland, and it was about Chief Okemos. And it was about how they buried Chief Okemos in the cemetery that's close to the river. But the claim of my great-great-uncle, from an oral history standpoint, is there's no body there. That his body was exhumed shortly after by his tribe and taken someplace and buried in secret. So I don't know if there's actually a body underneath the headstone that is in your cemetery, but I always thought that was a fascinating piece of history that you can pick up that you can't pick up other ways. It was a fun thing to be with those folks in the Niles Cemetery. They had a great day, and all the names that I read, all their families were there. They loved it, and not because of anything I said, but they just liked being part of it, and they liked seeing their families' names read again, and they liked knowing that they had a place in history. No matter what the consequences were, no matter how people got to that cemetery, I think people just felt like it was a good day to remember. So it was a nice day to be there. I was honored to give this talk. I brought copies if you'd like any of the information. But I have enjoyed learning more, and no matter what, I mentioned railroads are important, roads are important, but rivers really mean a lot. Without rivers, Lyons wouldn't be the end of the Dexter Trail. The Samuel Dexter that founded the Dexter Trail wouldn't have lost his son, Riley Bengal, in what is now Bengal Township, or Riley Township, I'm sorry. There's so much of history was founded along the way to people who were just looking for something different along rivers. It's an honor to be with you.